So tonight we do pick up in chapter 16. It took us several weeks to get through chapter 15 of Acts, but we will move on. And so chapter 16 begins, verse 1. Paul came to Derbe, and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him, and Paul wanted to take him along on a journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Many believe that there was about a 5-year span between the first missionary journey and this one. So he wants to go see how everything's going, wants to follow up with what's going on, and so out of that, he is going to make his way back to a lot of the places that he has been, just to kind of see how churches are doing and see how the congregations are going. And again, I think for some of us, we have to take ourselves back to that mindset that they didn't have telephones, they didn't have all the things that we have today, but they literally had to travel. They could hear by word of mouth, but he wants to begin to see it. So he begins introducing us to Timothy here, and you'll find a lot about Timothy and in Paul's writings. Timothy was one of his very much dedicated followers and young man that he invested in. You have heard me say before, and I think it's important that you hear that I believe every one of us in our lives needs a Paul and a Timothy. So we need a Paul, which if you count yourself a Timothy, you should be. You need somebody out there that you're learning from. And so it can be everything from a parent to a mentor to somebody just in your life that is more spiritually mature than you, or that challenges you. It doesn't always have to be someone that's older than you. It can just be somebody that you invest in, and somebody that just really challenges you and helps you grow. I do believe that in some form or fashion, for some of us, that role can, in a small way, be from somebody that we don't even deal with personally, but somebody that we listen to on a regular basis. Now, again, that can't be your only Paul, but there can be those there are those within my life that on a regular basis, I listen to their sermons or their leadership podcasts or things like that that are successful and I know can help me grow. And in that way, they're a Paul to me because they are someone that I'm looking up to. But I've also had those physical people in my life that I look up to, that I seek advice from, that I go to when I have concerns, things going on in my life, things like that. And so I think all of us have to have a Paul, but with that, every one of us as Christians have to have Timothys in our life. Those are people that we're investing in. Those are the ones that we are helping grow, that we're helping go through this journey called Christianity. And they're the ones that we're giving back to in a lot of ways. And so we have to have those people in our lives. We have to have Timothys as Christians that we're investing in. So we find here the beginning of the journey between Paul and Timothy, and you find here that Timothy has a good reputation. A lot of people have spoke highly of him from various areas. The only interesting part that we get to is that Timothy was not circumcised, and so with that, his father was a Greek, and his mother was Jewish and a believer. And we get back to this thing on circumcision. It's interesting, and I think that's why the 5 years is important, that 16 doesn't follow right after 15, if that makes sense to you. There is this time slot in there, but circumcision comes back up. Is this required? And not to rehash chapter 15 and all the tradition stuff we talked about, but what you find here as you look at Paul and Timothy, Timothy's situation, being uncircumcised, and Paul wanting to take him and him to be an influence, not only in the other communities, but especially in the Jewish community and those who had come out of the Jewish faith and those who were seeking to come out of the Jewish faith. Paul goes to him and says, with that, just so you're not a hindrance, we need to be we need to make sure you're circumcised. And so they went through this, and again, it's a reminder to me that there are certain things in our walk that may not be wrong. But if we are trying to reach a certain people, if we're trying to do a certain thing, if God has called us to something specific, there are some things that are maybe not wrong, that just aren't right trying to minister to that group. And so we find that here. And there are times within our walk and individually and with our church that there are times that we just maybe have to lose something or have to do something to reach the group that God has called us to reach. And that's a strong reminder to me, because I think we get so caught up in that if it's not wrong, I don't have to do it. And there's a lot of things in my ministry that I've had people say, I don't find scripturally where that's wrong, so I don't need, but again, if you're truly seeking God's heart, you just don't want to be a hindrance. And again, there are sometimes, and you can think through those on your own, but there are just things in our life that we have to be careful about so that we're not a hindrance to the kingdom, because I am reminded on a regular basis, we are either pointing people toward God or we're pointing people away from God, a lot of times by our actions, reactions, and our words. And so we find that reminder here in the beginning of chapter 16 as Paul goes to Timothy and says, sorry, but if you're going to go with me, we need to do circumcision. And again, not taking that lightly, but it's not that we're going to rehash that. We just want to make sure that you're not a hindrance. It goes on in verse 4 and says, they traveled from town to town. They delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. So out of that, they went and they continued to talk about decisions that the church has made. We looked at that in chapter 15. Again, not rehashing all that. But these are the things that are important. These are the things you need to hold to. These are the things that you need to do. And so they went in that. It's important in verse 5 that the churches were strengthened in their faith and grew daily in numbers. And I think that is our goal. I hear people within church all the time, especially those that their numbers are not growing, who say, numbers are not a big deal. And if you get caught up in the numbers, God is not about numbers. But I would disagree with that, and it's not about numbers just for the sake of numbers, but again, God is about numbers, because we find it all in the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts. We find that he talks on a regular basis about the numbers were growing, how many they were baptizing, how many they were reaching. So numbers are important. I like the way New Spring kind of phrases it, and I'm going to paraphrase this. I'll probably mess it up. But that numbers are people and people matter to God. And that's always kind of been a reminder to me that, the numbers, if you're talking 200, if you're talking 5, if you're talking 5,000, that 2 or that 5 or that 500 or that 5,000, those are numbers. But those numbers are people, and people matter to God. And so the numbers really do matter to God, and we're about growing the kingdom. So numbers do matter. And so we have to be concerned about that, and that's why we look at numbers. We look at numbers, or at least I look at numbers. I look at our giving each month, and God bless the last couple of months, our green has been higher than our red, which is always a good thing, whether it's church or whether it's home. We are looking at baptisms, because baptisms represent salvations. We're looking at growing. We're looking at Sunday school numbers. And out of that, one of the challenges I'm going to give in the next couple of weeks is that, we have to be intentional. And so to kind of preface it with you guys, because you guys are the leaders of your classes anyway, we have to be intentional of looking at when we leave out of Sunday school and we come back into the sanctuary and looking around and saying, who should be in my class? Who's sitting in the sanctuary that should be in my class? And I believe this with all my heart. It was a premise that a guy gave in a conference I was at years ago. I passed it on in youth ministry. I know it works. And that is, everybody that's in worship that needs to be in a Sunday school class needs to be contacted by 5 different people, okay? 5 different people. Need to invite them to Sunday school at least 5 times. So that's 25 contacts. So we're not talking about you go to them one time and you go to whoever and say, hey, we'd love to have you in our Sunday school class, and I don't care whether this is anything from teenagers all the way up through our senior adult classes, but 5 different people, contact each one of them 5 different times, 25 different contacts, to say to them, we want you to be in Sunday school. You had heard me say, and I believe this with all my heart, Sunday school is the most vital time that we have, maybe even more than worship. Well, let me back up. I know more important than worship, because if we can get them in Sunday school, they'll get in worship. But Sunday school is where relationships happen, where ministry happens, where lives are changed. And so we need to get people in Sunday school. And out of that, I'm going to really begin to challenge, that our Sunday school numbers go up. And out of that, I'm going to also challenge that our worship numbers go up, because we have to get more intentional about holding each other accountable. And again, it's not a bad thing, and sometimes we look at accountability and say it's a bad thing, but that when somebody's missing Sunday school, they ought to be contacted. Our young adult class is doing a great job right now. If you're not in Sunday school, in fact, they normally know before Sunday happens, because they send the text out on Saturday night or Sunday morning, who's going to be there, who's not going to be there. It kind of started out of them having breakfast. But out of it now, they're holding each other accountable. Hey, we missed you. We're praying for you. And I know at different times you have to be gone for different reasons, but people have to know that they're missed. People have to know that they're loved. And that's not just in Sunday school, that's also in worship. And when we see people missing, we need to do a good job of reaching out to them. And so numbers are important. Going on in verse 6, and Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. This is one of those verses that you kind of look at and go, did that say what I think that said? And you go back and read it, and it says, yes, that Paul and his companions were being kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. And you look at that at times and you go, how's that possible? Why would the Holy Spirit ever keep someone from preaching? And one of the things that I have learned, it's right time, right place, right person. Right time, right place, right person. And sometimes it may not be the right time. Because you understand, God's timing is not our timing. Sometimes it may not be the right place. There may be a better place for it. Sometimes you're just not the right person. And so there comes that following the Holy Spirit. And sometimes the Holy Spirit, as we're going to look Sunday morning at God and how God works, but sometimes the Holy Spirit and God, it goes against what we would think as a Christian, and we have to be obedient and we have to be faithful in that. And so the Holy Spirit kept him from going to Ephesus for some reason at that point. It goes on in verse 7 and says, and when they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went to Troas. Again, God turned them away. The question comes, are we disobedient? Are we seeking God's will, or are we seeking our own will? Sometimes things may make sense in human terms, but not in God's terms. It's been said that David Livingstone wanted to go to China, but God sent him to Africa. William Carey wanted to go to Polynesia, but God sent him to India. Adoniram Judson went to India, but God guided him, wanted to go to India, but God guided him to Burma. God guides us along the path that He needs us to be, not where we want to be. I probably have shared this, and I'll share the short version. When I was at Boone Trail, been there, I reckon, about 6 or 7 years, and our senior pastor, Ira, had to retire due to physical conditions, and so kind of abrupt. And out of that, things were going really, really good at the church, and so the search committee and the deacons decided that I needed to be the interim pastor, and so kept all my roles, everything I was already doing, but served as interim pastor, preached on Sunday mornings, and most of the time on Sunday nights, Wednesday nights. Some of the other guys filled in. And out of that, God really did some amazing stuff. And so biggest numbers in the history of the church, still is to this day. Most money taken in, paid off a $2 million kind of Family Life Center edition, youth and children's area, Family Life Center. More baptisms, more growth in Sunday school, more everything. Every area of the church grew during that 18 months. And the search committee, several months into this, came to me and said, we're opening for resumes. Are you going to apply? And Kim and I had been talking about it. Kim and I had been praying about it. And I said, I'll just have to let you know. At this point, God hasn't given me a peace. And one of the guys looked at me and said, what does that even mean? What does that mean that God hasn't given you a peace? And I said, well, if God doesn't tell me to apply, then I'm not supposed to apply. And so we went on several months, and things just going great, and they were getting ready to close out accepting resumes. And the chairman of the search committee came to me and he said, this is last week. Are you not going to apply? And I said, no. I said, God hasn't given me a peace. And I can remember looking at him and saying, I don't understand. I really don't. Because it makes sense in human terms. It makes sense almost from a church point of view. Because again, everything's going good. Everything's, where it's supposed to be. But I just don't get a peace from God. Kim doesn't get a peace from God. And so out of that, I'm not applying. And several of our friends and others came to us and just, I don't understand. Why won't you be our next senior pastor? And I said, I don't know. I don't know what God's plan is. I don't know what God's will is, why He won't give me that peace. But I said, I've always had a peace. And living outside that peace is not a place that I want to be. And so out of that, I'm not going to do something that I don't feel God is leading me to do. And so out of that, I kind of get to Acts 16 every time I read through this, and since then, and I understand. And I've got to imagine from Paul's point of view, it's a struggle. How do you know that, there are people